Welcome back, everybody. This is for a class for Monday, March 1st, for English 221 Shakespeare, where we've got a few odds and ends to talk about with the Midsummer Night's Dream. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about our first paper, which won't be due until the ending of the month, and for us to get ready for our second play in the comedy section of the class, and that happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. So, in terms of our journal number 2, Midsummer Night's Dream, that's going to be due this Wednesday, the 3rd. And the second journal will be very similar to what you did with the first, approximately a page or so of observations, thoughts, reflections, this time about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I'll evaluate it in the same way that I evaluated your sonnet journal, informally, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And I will give it a check mark grade, and a plus is excellent, and a check plus is very good, and a check is satisfactory. And then ultimately I will return the journal back to you, and perhaps your thoughts and reflections might help you with your first paper. I'm going to be supplying you with some sample paper topics for you to consider, but you are also free to create your own paper topic as well, which we will discuss. So as long as you get that topic approved by me, then you can consider that a topic that would be acceptable for your first paper. But first, let me finish up with The Midsummer Night's Dream before I begin talking more about the paper itself. And I wanted to just draw your attention to a few of the quotes in Shakespeare. We didn't talk much about Shakespearean language. And one of the quotes that I wanted to draw your attention to, and you can see that I've listed these in the notes below the video, happens to be in Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 through 95. And you'll see that in the notes below, what I've done in quotation marks is I've indicated the act, and that happens to be a 1, and then a period, and then the scene, and that also happens to be a 1, but this time in lowercase, with a period, and then 93 through 95, and those are the page numbers, and then a closing quotation mark. And that's the formula for documenting or quoting from Shakespeare. Usually when we quote by giving the page number of the quote in parentheses following the quote. But with Shakespeare, we don't need to rely on the page number, and this is actually a good thing, because when you're relying on page numbers, then you're also relying on particular editions, because different editions will have different page numbers, which is always the challenge when you're using a text that is not the text that's been assigned for a particular class. But the good thing about Shakespeare is that his plays are divided up by act and scene and line, so that regardless of the version that you happen to be reading, we can all reference the same place within the drama. So we don't need to use page numbers in the way we would when we were quoting from, let's say, short stories or even other dramas or from poems. And you'll see that in Act 1, Scene 1, line 93, and it's just a very brief line, but it strikes me as a very good illustration of Shakespeare's wit. And this is Lysander speaking. And Lysander is speaking to Demetrius. And Lysander says to Demetrius, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermia's." In other words, well, Demetrius, Aegeus, Hermia's father, already loves you, so you don't need any more love, so let me have Hermia's love. And I like those little pieces of wit that are embedded within Shakespeare's writing. There's a very famous quote that I wanted to draw your attention to, also in Act 1. Act 1, Scene 1, line 134. And this is again Lysander speaking, saying, "The course of true love never did run smooth." You may have heard that quote in other contexts. The course of true love never did run smooth. And now you know that comes from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Rhyme. One of the things we talked about with Shakespeare was his incredible ability to use rhyme and language, and that oftentimes, even in his dramas, he would use poetry. And we see some of that in the dialogue of some of the characters. And I wanted to draw your attention to two specific examples, also in Act 1. One happens to be an example of good rhyme, and one happens to be an example of bad rhyme. And the good rhyme happens to be the kind of rhyme that Shakespeare would use for his characters. And this happens to be Hermia, and she is just basically talking to Helena about how she's planning on running away. It's a fairly simple scene. That said, we can see how Shakespeare is still able to utilize poetry and poetic forms like rhyme and still be able to forward plot. So that's in Act 1, Scene 1, line 202, when Hermia says to Helena, "Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned a heaven unto a hell." The rhyme is very natural, and it helps forward the plot at the same time. Example of bad rhyme would be some of the rhymes of Bottom when he is rehearsing the play Pyramus and Thisbe. Now we know that Bottom is an ass, and we know that he acts like an ass even before he's transformed into an ass, which is why he's transformed into an ass. He's very arrogant and full of himself. And in Act 1, we see him rehearse for the play Pyramus and Thisbe. And while he is speaking in rhyme, because he is in character for the rehearsal, it's very bad rhyme, certainly in comparison to what we just saw with Hermia speaking. And this happens to be Act 1, Scene 1, line 31. And basically what Bottom says in character, "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates." And then he says after that, "This was lofty." Just to illustrate his arrogance, he basically has complimented himself by saying that he's just said something very astute and erudite, but he hasn't. When it's true that he's got rhyme, rocks and shocks and locks, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good rhyme. So if you've ever heard "Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you," it rhymes, but it doesn't necessarily illustrate good rhyme. And basically, he's just speaking nonsense here. So one of the reasons why Shakespeare would do this, as I had indicated last class, is that he wants Bottom and his cohorts to represent Shakespeare's competition, and that this is the kind of writing and the kind of production values we can expect if we were going to spend our time and, more importantly, our money by watching Shakespeare's competition. Now, the insults in this play are fast and furious, as I had indicated that I call Act 3 the catfight scene, when the lovers can very easily come to blows. And some of the insults aren't very obvious as insults until we actually analyze them. But I wanted to just begin with the insults on Act 3, or in Act 3, Scene 2, line 258. And here is where we get Lysander basically telling Hermia, "Away, you Ethiop." Now remember, he used to love or he used to love Hermia. So now he's telling her to go away, and he's calling her an Ethiop. The idea that her dark features, her dark eyes, and her dark hair would be similar to something one would find in Ethiopia. And then they continue on, and Lysander says, "Hang off, thou cat, thou burr, vile thing let loose, or shall I shake thee from me like a serpent?" And of course, Hermia is stunned. She doesn't understand because he used to love her. And he's gotten cruel and mean. And he says, "Out, tawny Tartar, out, loathed medicine." So now he's calling her a loathed medicine. "Out, hated potion, hence." And then he says, "Should I hurt her, strike her, kill her dead? Although I hate her, I'll not harm her so." Notice what his first go-to place is that, well, I could kill her. And this illustrates the very thin line there is between love and hate. And as the insults continue, we see how Hermia is now hurling insults at Helena, accusing Helena of stealing her man. And Hermia says to Helena, who is her former best friend, "You juggler, you canker blossom, you thief of love. What, Have you come by night and stolen my love's heart from him? And then she continues on and says, have you no mockery? No maiden, oh, well, this is Helena, I'm sorry, that says, have you no modesty? No maiden shame? No touch of bashfulness? Fie, you counterfeit, you puppet, you. Puppet is a direct insult from Helena to Hermia because of Hermia's short stature. And also the idea that Hermia is being controlled by another, which is what happens with a puppet. Hermia's response is, puppet? Ah, that way goes the game. I perceive she may compare between our statures. She urged her height, and with her personage, her tall personage, her height forsooth, she prevailed with him. And are you grown so high in his esteem, because I am so dwarfish and so low? How low am I, thou painted maypole? And we already talked about painted maypole and how that's an insult. And she continues on and says, I'm not yet so low that my nails can reach unto thine eyes. So she's basically threatening to rip out her former best friend's eyes. And Helena says, though you mock me, let her not hurt me. I was never cursed to have no gift at all in shrewishness. I'm a right maid for my cowardice. Let her not strike me. You perhaps may think because she is something lower than myself that I can match her. And again, there are more height jokes here, as well as the idea of lower being not as beautiful or not as important. And then Helena continues on and says, oh, when Hermia, when she's angry, she's keen and shrewd. She was a vixen when she went to school. And though she be but little, she's fierce. Again, more references to Hermia's height. And Hermia says, little again? Nothing but low and little? Well, will you suffer her to flout me thus? Let me come to her. In other words, let me get her. And Lysander's response is, get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus of hindering knotgrass maid, you bead, you acorn. Again, all of these are insults. Dwarf, in other words, short stature. Minimus, bead and acorn, again, that she's very small. So we can see how Shakespeare takes this opportunity to illustrate how easily love can turn to hate and can destroy friendships. But we know that we have a comedy, so we've got to have a resolution, and we do. Now, we also know that Shakespeare usually tries to embed within his plays other things, such as a compliment, if that's going to further his career. And that's exactly what we've got in Act 5, Scene 1, line 93. And there are lots of reasons for Act 5, even though it seems to be superfluous. Act 5 provides a lot of comedy. Act 5 also gives us the play within a play, so we've got metadrama. Act 5 also illustrates within a play, how love can turn tragic. And luckily for us, in Act 3, as tragic as things look like they were happening in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or at least luckily for the lovers, as tragic as things look like in Act 3, there is going to be a positive resolution to that. We know also that in Act 5, this is Shakespeare's opportunity to make commentary through the horrific performance of Pyramus and Thisbe about his competitors and talk and mock, really, their abilities or lack of abilities. But what seems to be a very simple exchange in Act 5, Scene 1, line 93. And this is a really good example of how Shakespeare is very politically astute. Theseus and Hippolyta are speaking with one another prior to the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe. And what Theseus says to Hippolyta in Act 5, Scene 1, around line 93 or so, is that where I have come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, where I've seen them shiver and look pale, make periods in the midst of sentences, throttle their practiced accent in their fears, and in conclusion dumbly have broke off, not paying me a welcome. Trust me, sweet, out of this silence yet I picked a welcome, and in the modesty of fearful duty, I read as much as from the rattling tongue of saucy and audacious eloquence. Love, therefore, in tongue-tied simplicity, in least speak most to my capacity. basically what he's saying is that he is accustomed as a king to have individuals try to greet him and give him proper honor, but they're so nervous that they aren't able to do so. And he doesn't see this as an insult. He actually sees this as a compliment, that they wouldn't be nervous in the first place if they didn't have respect and esteem for him. And he's basically saying that this is the way that he conducts himself in his kingship. And the assumption is that this line or this section was directed specifically to Queen Elizabeth, who would have been the ruler at the time, as she would have been watching this particular play. And that Queen Elizabeth should see elements of herself within this speech, that she should also consider herself very similar to what Theseus is in terms of being a very gracious ruler and being able to acknowledge someone's insecurities and someone's nervousness and view that as a compliment. Always a good idea to compliment your queen if she's watching the play. Of course, we know that if Shakespeare has an opportunity to make a reference to sex, he's going to take that opportunity. And while we've talked about some of the sexual innuendos in this play, there's one that I wanted to draw your attention to in Act 5. And this is in Act 5, Scene 1, line 188. And this is where we've got Pyramus and Thisbe speaking to one another, again, within their play, within a play. And Thisbe says, "O wall, full often hast thou heard my moans, for parting my fair Pyramus and me. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." And this section is usually read as a reference to oral sex, where Thisbe is saying, "Full often hast thou heard my moans," the moans of sexual pleasure, "for parting my fair Pyramus and me. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones being testicles, thy stones with lime and hair being in reference to pubic hair, knit up in thee." So I won't take credit or blame for that. I'm just really indicating what other scholars have said about that particular line. And then I wanted to end with the final speech. This happens to be Puck's final speech. And Puck has oftentimes been read as a kind of Shakespeare character, sort of controlling and manipulating action and taking great delight in doing so. And while Puck is perhaps not necessarily the, let's say, main character, he certainly is one of the main characters. We know that with comedies, you don't necessarily have a main character in the way that you might with tragedies, for instance, Macbeth and Othello and so forth. But Puck is oftentimes not only an audience favorite, but an actor favorite, because there is so much room for interpretation. You can play Puck as an innocent who truly just makes a mistake with the love juice, or you can play Puck as a very calculating sort of figure that very deliberately wanted to create havoc, or someplace in between. And Puck says at the very ending, and this is a very famous speech from Shakespeare, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And, as I am an honest Puck, if you have unearned luck, now to escape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call. So, good night unto you all. Give me your hands, if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends." Talking about the idea that if the actors have offended, or the characters have offended, think that you, or pretend that you were just sleeping and all of this was a dream. And of course, the idea of dream is embedded throughout the entire drama, that love itself is kind of a dream. Gentles, meaning gentlemen and gentlewomen, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. So this is where he's directly asking for pardon if anybody's been offended. And considering that Shakespeare has mocked literally everybody when it comes to love, you could think of the entire audience having taken some offense. And as I am an honest Puck, and we have to stop here because Puck is anything but honest. We know he's mischievous and somewhat deceptive. So in this line right here, he's just undercut this supposed apology. Very Puck-like, isn't it? It's almost when somebody tells you that they're sorry that you're upset rather than apologizing. And as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck, now to escape the serpent's tongue. The serpent's tongue would be the hissing, the boos and the hisses of the audience. We will make amends ere long. We'll fix things. Else the Puck a liar call. And again, the thing is, Puck is a liar. So, good night unto you all. So this is basically his way of saying, play's over, goodbye. Give me your hands if we be friends. And the way that he wants people's hands are through applause. And Robin, because another name for Puck is Robin Goodfellow, shall restore amends. And again, this is the character of Puck asking for forgiveness. This is the actor who's playing Puck asking for forgiveness. And this is Shakespeare asking for forgiveness. So this is working on multiple levels. So we could spend an entire semester just talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, but obviously we have to move on. And you know we're moving on to Much Ado About Nothing. And similar to Midsummer Night's Dream, I'll have us watch a performance and then we'll talk about themes and issues. And of course, with the caution that watching a performance is never a substitute for reading the play. And you'll see that Much Ado About Nothing is definitely a play that's set in the world of reality. And in some ways, Much Ado About Nothing is a much darker play than what we saw with Midsummer Night's Dream. I mean, certainly Oberon can be dark. And I've seen him played much darker, considering the way that he treats Titania so badly. But we've got a legitimate villain in Much Ado About Nothing, Don John. And we'll talk a little bit about him and how this play is in many ways anticipatory of one of Shakespeare's most famous tragedies, a tragedy that we will be reading and studying and watching in class, and that happens to be Othello. And while the play is supposed to be centering on Claudio and on his love life, really what we're most interested in is Benedict and his love life. So the play is more about Benedict and Beatrice than it is about Claudio and Hero, even though ultimately Claudio and Hero are the impetus for most of the actions that occur. And we'll talk about that as well. And if you were reading Midsummer Night's Dream carefully, you'll notice that Bottom oftentimes speaks in prose rather than poetry. And you can tell because prose goes from one end of the line to the other, a complete sentence, much in the way that we would speak, rather than verse or poetry, which is the staggered line. And verse and poetry is usually considered to be a higher form of language. Much Ado About Nothing, the next play we're reading, is in prose, which again sets that play into a world of reality and also sets that play into a much lower level of status than what we might find in other plays and in other comedies. So keep that in mind as you are reading Much Ado About Nothing. And you should be reading Much Ado About Nothing at this particular point. And ideally, by the time we start talking about it in depth next class, you would have read Much Ado About Nothing in its entirety. But I know the world isn't ideal, and obviously we have multiple classes devoted to Much Ado About Nothing. So try to read as much as you can over the course of that. And while we're talking about Much Ado About Nothing, my hope is always that you are thinking about the next play and beginning to read the next play, which for us would be our transition to a history play. And that happens to be Richard II. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I wanted to shift gears and talk about our first paper, which is going to be due at the ending of March, because by that point we would have concluded 2 comedies as well as Shakespeare's sonnets. So I think that there's enough material there that you could write a paper about if you so wanted to. Your paper is going to be due on the 31st of March, which happens to be a Wednesday, though early papers always accepted. And your first paper will be 4 to 5 pages long, and that's merely a guesstimate. Your paper should be as long or as short as it needs to be, but I'm approximating 4 to 5 pages, double space, 1-inch margins. And it's a critical paper, which means that you wouldn't be writing a research paper by looking up outside resources, that you would just be analyzing the text itself. Because one of the purposes of this class is to give you experience with reading and interpreting the text on your own without having to rely on scholars or critics or teachers, so that hopefully when the class is over you can continue to read other Shakespearean works and have enough experience and skill so that you can begin to make sense of it on your own. That said, if you have your heart set on a research paper, I'm not necessarily averse to it. We would just have to negotiate. Writing a research paper in some ways is a more challenging exercise because not only do you have to incorporate your own ideas and thoughts, but you also have to incorporate the thoughts of others. And what oftentimes happens with research papers is that people incorporate, or writers incorporate, the thoughts of others and never add their own additional ideas and thoughts. And you've got to do both. So in some ways, a research paper might be a bit more of a challenging exercise. And you can see that in our syllabus and other documents folder, I have included a handout for paper topics or suggested paper topics that will work for both paper number 1 and also paper number 2. Paper number 2 is going to be due at the ending of the semester. My thinking is that paper number 1 could deal with the comedies, either Midsummer or Much Ado, and then paper number 2 could either address Richard II, our history, or our 2 tragedies, which happen to be Macbeth and Othello. And there also is the possibility of The Tempest as an extra credit if you wanted to pursue that. We're not reading The Tempest, but if you wanted to read it as an extra credit, I've indicated that in class, and you can always devote a paper to it if you so wanted to. And I just wanted to briefly go through this handout with you, that paper number 1 and paper number 2 are critical papers. In other words, you should not be consulting outside resources. However, if you want to write a research paper, please consult with me. Paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages long. Choose any of the topics listed or write on your own topic. The following are only suggestions, so feel free to adapt, combine, or dismiss. If you choose to write on your own topic, you should briefly discuss the topic with me. And I hope all of you will ultimately talk with me about what you are considering to discuss in your paper. And that's something that you could do, for instance, in a journal, if you so wanted to. Please use the MLA system of parenthetical documentation when quoting from the text. In other words, in parentheses, axing, and line. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well as we proceed. And see the syllabus for paper formatting specifications. That's where it indicates that papers should be typed, double-spaced, 1-inch margins. And I've given very general topics here because I want you to come up with the specific thesis. As I've indicated here, paper number 1 should address the comedies, either A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. Paper number 2, the history, Richard II, or the tragedies, Macbeth, Othello, though The Tempest is a possibility as well. And also for paper number 1, the sonnets could also be a possibility. But keep in mind that writing about poems is a different kind of exercise than writing about drama. So I'm not necessarily averse to you writing on the sonnets. That is an option if you so wanted to pursue it. So I've put down some ideas, the first being on imagery. So if you're interested in examining imagery in a paper, isolate a central, particularly meaningful image, such as like dark imagery, animal imagery, food imagery, and so forth, and discuss one of the plays in terms of that image and what it discloses. In other words, unlike the journals, which basically don't have to focus on any particular element, the papers do have to focus on a particular element and do so in a certain amount of depth. And of course, grammar and mechanics are just as important as the actual content, unlike the journals where I'm reading for content but not for grammar and mechanics. And for the papers, I will evaluate them with letter grades. And you have the option of rewriting the first paper if you so like. So if you feel some anxiety about paper number 1, you can think of it as a kind of draft if you'd like. Submit it in to me. I'll evaluate it, get it back to you. And if it turns out that you are not satisfied with your grade, you can take my comments into account and then you can do a revision. I just ask that you hand in the original paper with my comments along with your revision by the last day of class, though the sooner the better for everybody involved, and you would get the higher of the 2 grades. So that perhaps is something that would be of interest to you if you're not exactly feeling very comfortable with the first paper. But if you don't want to talk about something like imagery, another idea could be talking about characters, because we are working with dramas after all. So perhaps examining one of the characters in one of the plays and this particular character's contribution to the play at large. Or perhaps you want to examine something like a theme, some sort of a universal issue. Analyze a major theme in one of the plays. For instance, revenge or suspicion or trust or death or love or power or justice. etc. Or maybe you like compare and contrast papers. I've always liked comparing and contrasting, where you can compare and contrast perhaps two characters or two themes. Keep in mind that the compare and contrast paper can be tricky because you don't want it to be too large. So you want to have some sort of a specific thesis. So if you were going to compare and contrast A Midsummer Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing, I would not compare and contrast those two plays in their entirety because you would have a very, very long analysis. But you could perhaps compare and contrast two characters, one within each play. That would make a good amount of sense. So perhaps you might want to compare and contrast something like Hermia or someone like Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. That would make a certain level of sense in terms of talking about both plays. Or gender. Analyze one or two of the plays in terms of gender or power relationships. How does Shakespeare present the relationships between, let's say, women and men? Or how about women and women? Or how about men and men in the world of the play? And at the bottom, I have a quote that I put on all of my paper topic assignments in all of my classes. Quote, a good question to ask yourself, the quote begins soon. A good question to ask yourself when you are writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, have I, or has the author, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? And unquote, and that is in parentheses Biddle 9, so you can see that Biddle is the author, 9 is the page number. And if I were to include a works cited page after this, I would have all of the details about the text that Biddle wrote, including the place of publication and the publisher, so that you could get a hold of that copy and look up page 9 and find that particular quote. So this is a tall order, saying things clearly, concisely, believably, and gracefully. So usually the best way to do this is to start writing early and then to write multiple drafts and then continue to revise and edit rather than trying to write it all in one marathon session right before it's due. So one of the things I'll be doing over the next couple of classes is talking about how to construct papers. And very briefly, you can see that I've indicated that there is a handout that I have put in your syllabus and other documents folder, and I will be referencing it in greater depth over the next couple classes as well about how to write a paper. And actually it was a handout that was given to me when I was an undergraduate in my Shakespeare class, and I have yet to see a handout that does as good of a job in terms of summarizing how to construct a paper. So I thought I would review that with you, and you can see that basically there are three elements, and I'll talk about more in depth all of them. Planning, writing, editing. And I can tell you right now, most students skip planning, go straight to writing, run out of time, and never have time for editing. So what I'm encouraging you to do now is planning, thinking about what will I write about and why. Then you can start doing the writing. And rather than trying to write the perfect first sentence, what I encourage you to do is to write out a list of ideas and then to go back to it and to begin to construct sentences and paragraphs around them. It's usually a much more efficient way to write. And then finally, to leave yourself time for editing so you can reread what you've written. I recommend you read it out loud so that you can hear it. Hopefully you can have some time, some distance between when you were last writing and when you can edit so that you can see more mistakes. And then you want to try to change it so that it is as clear and concise as possible. But I had a professor in college who once said a very astute thing, that basically a paper's never really done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And I think that's true. You could spend a lifetime working on trying to improve your writing, but at some point you've got to hand it in, and for us that happens to be the ending of March. So this gives you a good month or so to begin thinking about your planning, your writing, and ultimately your editing. And what we will talk about next class is some of the basics associated with writing, including having an introductory paragraph, which is where you include your thesis, your main point, and the name of the author and the text that you happen to be examining. Your body paragraphs, this is where you give your evidence, your quotation and your paragraph, your paraphrase to support whatever it is you're saying. Because whatever you propose in your thesis, something that reasonable people could disagree about, something that could be debated or argued. My job as a reader is to take the opposite viewpoint. So basically what you have to do is to try to convince me, almost as if you were an attorney trying to convince a judge and jury to support a particular position. And it doesn't even have to be completely accurate. It just has to be possible, which gives you a lot more latitude than perhaps what you might find in a courtroom, because in a courtroom, it's usually either guilty or innocent. And in terms of writing a piece of literature, there could be two papers, one that takes one position, let's say guilty, the other that takes the other position that could be innocent. Both could be equally plausible and both could be A papers. So the standard of proof is not necessarily as high in writing a paper as it would be in a court of law. So again, it just has to be possible. It doesn't even have to be probable. So that said, it's all about the evidence that you use in the text in order to be able to support your position. You need to have evidence. And then finally, a conclusion, which is where you give closure. And thinking that a paragraph is 3 or more sentences, anything less than that would not be considered an academic paragraph. So you want to make sure that you're having well-developed paragraphs. And each paragraph probably has a topic sentence, or most paragraphs have a topic sentence, an opening sentence that basically summarizes what your paragraph is about, so that you can basically follow through your opening sentences the construction of your paper. But as I said, I'll discuss that further next class. That's where I will be picking up, is on the handout about how to write a paper. And I'll also talk a little bit about quotation. And we'll also begin with viewing Much Ado About Nothing. So for today's attendance question, I thought I could get you to start thinking about that first paper by asking you, what do you think will be your greatest challenge writing paper number 1, and why? And you can submit that in by the 2nd of March, Tuesday, 8 a.m. Of course, if you need an extension, just ask me and I'll be happy to grant you one. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.